So I'm super excited to have Vicki Abeles. Did I get it right?
Yeah.
Close? All right,
enough.
Excellent. Yes. Close enough. To have Vicki here. She's an inspiration. She began her career as a Wall Street attorney and turned filmmaker in 2007 when she co-directed the award-winning documentary Race to Nowhere, which is more than a film, it's more a phrase now used by parents, a rallying cry. It's a vivid portrayal of the pressure cooker culture dominating America's schools, which you got a taste of in the videos we showed. So Vicki showcased Race to Nowhere in more than 7,000 community-sponsored screenings, including multiple showings at Google years ago, to millions of viewers around the globe. She is also the author of a book. There it is. That's after you read this book, it will be full of Post-it notes, I guarantee you. She's an amazing book, Beyond Measure, which is also a documentary of the same name. Which builds on Race to Nowhere. We're looking at practical solutions that you can take into your homes, classrooms, and school districts starting tomorrow or even today. So Vicki's films and books were a wake-up call in our family and in our district where the film was shown, both films, and has served as a rallying cry to make a difference in the lives of our children and the students of our community. So Vicki, welcome to Google.
Thank you.
So I'm going to let you do most of the talking. And in a little bit, we're going to introduce a special Googler to join us. But I want to start with the thought of producing not one film, but two. And authoring a book is absolutely daunting. Doing any one of those three is daunting. So talk about the moment when you were inspired to devote so much energy to this task.
Sure. So about 10 years ago, my daughters were in middle school in 5th and 7th grade. And as a parent, I started to see the pressures and the toll that school was taking on them and our family. I saw two young girls who went from being happy, confident girls who loved school to losing sleep, to becoming anxious, to waking up in panic attacks during the middle of the night about a test the next day. And I started to wonder if this was just my family. So I started speaking to families in my community and then eventually to families, educators, health professionals across the country. And what I discovered was an epidemic of unhealthy, unprepared, disengaged young people. And then about 6 months into my research, a young girl, 13 years old, same age as my oldest daughter, took her life after failing a math test. And it was in that moment that I knew I had to do something. And so I thought to myself, what if we could do something to really listen to our kids, to give our kids a voice? And those questions are what ultimately led to Race to Nowhere.
That's amazing. That I can't think of anything more motivating, and I wish that's not what it took to motivate change. But that kind of leads into the second question, which is fear is a powerful motivator, although we spoke at lunch how this really should be about inspiring people. So should parents be scared about the health of their children or see a tremendous opportunity to do something much better? And if so, why? Why is it either the case?
Right. So I don't want to be alarmist, but here's what the data shows, right? 1 in 3 students reported to the American Psychological Association that they are stressed and that stress is leading them to depression. The number one source of that stress, cited by 83% of students, was school. The CDC reports that the majority of teenagers in this country get 2 hours less of sleep each night than what's recommended. And then in a recent survey that we conducted in collaboration with a pediatrician from St. Louis at a local Bay Area high school, what we discovered was really concerning. We did a survey about the wellness of that community serving middle-class families, about 2,000 high school students. More than 50% of those students were showing signs of moderate to severe depression, more than 50%. I think what we have, James, is a public health crisis on a scale that we have yet to fully recognize. And at the same time, I think that we need to use that data and what we know, even anecdotally in our homes, in our classrooms, in our communities, to inspire action. And just a quick example, you may be familiar with us, but the Burbank School District has taken these issues seriously. They've created a wellness task force, and they now have a wellness center at one of their high schools. They adopted a suicide prevention policy in their district, which involved professional development for all professionals ranging from teachers to administrators to janitors. And they are also addressing the source of the unhealthy stress in our kids' lives, ranging from homework to AP courses to too much testing. So I'm really inspired by that story, and there are stories like that which you know we write about in our book.
Yes. Well, I'm going to switch around a little bit and talk about wellness for a second. So mindfulness is something that is been taught to thousands of Googlers as one of the training programs we get to take. It's addressing stress is one of the things we think about as part of our culture. How have some of the districts that you've spoken to taken practical steps on addressing stress?
So we see a number of districts and schools and even teachers who are adopting mindfulness programs, adding yoga to the school day. And I think that's terrific, and there's great research to support the benefits of that. At the same time, I am an advocate for getting to the source of the unhealthy stress. And I think, unfortunately, too many of our kids are suffering from a system and a culture that values busyness. And oftentimes that means too much homework, that values constant measurement and the arms race to college. And I think that it is really incumbent upon all of us as people who care for students, for children, to address those unhealthy stressors and at the same time to add programs like mindfulness.
So that leads to the next thought I have is, all right, so part of this is students get caught up in the arms race with their peers, feel like it's a badge of honor to lose sleep and to take 10 AP classes. Parents get terrified about their kids getting into the right school, and everyone seems to be trapped in this cycle. So how do you respond to this fear of being disadvantaged if you're the first one to try to address this problem?
Right. So, and I think that's an excellent point, is that no one really wants to step off the treadmill first, right? But we're at Google here today, and so let's think about the things that make people at Google successful, right? I imagine many people at this company are successful because they're creative, because they're self-starters, because they know how to get things done. And unfortunately, our schools today are set up in ways that our kids spend most of their day sitting in rows, consuming information and regurgitating it. That's what we value in many of our schools today. And unfortunately, we crowd out the opportunity for them to develop the very skills that are going to serve them not just in college and in their future employment, but in life. And so, what I find really inspiring are the schools that we have followed these last 3 years in the film Beyond Measure and in the book that are taking steps to reimagine what's possible in our schools. And I think that's the question we need to ask ourselves. What if we designed schools in a way that prioritized wellness and learning?
So in the movie, you have some amazing examples of innovation around schools changing. Charter schools, public schools, that didn't really seem to be the factor. It was just schools that took that first step, not just the individual, but what are some of the most inspiring examples of schools that have taken that leap of faith and seen it, at least head in the right direction?
Right. So we've visited schools that are taking steps big and small. What I want to highlight is that the process of change, the process that creates change is really what we want to be focusing on, and it's critical that that process include all of the stakeholders in a community, ranging from students. Students need to be an important voice in these conversations. They need to inform the design or the redesign of school. In fact, in all of the schools that we feature in our new film, students were an integral part of that design process. You need to engage the superintendents, the community members. I think everybody needs to be a part of this conversation. There's no greater resource and important issue, I think, than addressing the well-being of our kids and their preparation for their futures.
So what have you learned to help students break this cycle, even if their parents are pushing them and even if the districts are pushing them? And I think when we get to Ken, that's a great example of that locally. But where they get into the idea that this studying late at night and even pretending to go to sleep, as you wrote about, and having wake up in the middle of the night doing homework when their parents think they're asleep, what are some of the ways to have students believe it's in their best interest?
Well, so one of the ways to have them believe it's in their best interest is to tell them stories of people who have taken alternative paths to really convince them that it's not the name of the college that one attends that determines your success in life. And in fact, what colleges, what employers are looking for are people who are passionate, people who are interested, people who want to contribute something positive to the world. That being said, I think there's a lot of things that individuals can do in their home, both parents and students, from modeling balance as parents for our children to encouraging our children to not overschedule, both academically and in terms of extracurriculars. But I also think that puts a lot of burden on individuals. And what I want to say to you, James, is that I think the individuals are responding right now to the culture that exists, right? And if you are a parent with a child in school, school is the culture. And that culture really impacts your family and your student. And so that's why I'm a big advocate for school change as well. I think that we need to move away from what has become a blame game of blaming college admissions or blaming helicopter parents and say the individuals are responding to the system and the culture, and we all make up that culture. And what we're trying to do is to empower people to change that culture, and that takes a different mindset about the things that matter.
So that kind of leads to, if you're trying to implement any kind of change, if you're trying to sell something, you're going to run into objections. People are going to come up with all kinds of reasons not to do things. It's human nature, and to be static in some ways. So what are some of the most common objections you hear that you expect to hear, and how do you counter those objections?
Yeah, so I think the most common objection to things like reducing the number of AP courses or reducing the amount of homework is our kids won't be prepared for what's coming next. And the reality is, research is very clear that the best way to prepare people for bad situations, let's just say high school homework, is to have lots of good experiences along the way. But the other argument that I'll make, James, is that we know that our kids are incredibly unhealthy. They're sleep deprived, they're anxious, they're depressed. They're contemplating suicide at increasing rates. And at the same time, we hear from college professors and from employers that they're showing up unprepared for the kind of thinking and problem solving that's needed. So I don't really think there's a reason for us not to make the change. Oftentimes, I think what keeps us stuck in the status quo is a mindset that school is best done as it's always done. And it's incredibly, there are a lot of stakeholders that need to come to the table in order to make the changes.
So before we bring our next member of the panel up here, want to finish the questions directly to you about you end the book in a very practical way, which is great. I think that's part of the reason I think you went from Race to Nowhere to Beyond Measure, to give people a sense of what to do. So of the many suggestions you make at the end of the book, what are a couple that you would, for the people on the live stream here in the audience, watch this later on YouTube, what are some steps that they can take starting tomorrow that you think are the most practical to just get started?
Okay, so I have a long-winded answer to that. So big picture in our schools, I think that we need to consider three things. We need to prioritize wellness, and that means addressing the unhealthy stressors. We need to recalibrate the way time is spent in our schools around a whole new set of priorities, and we need to transform learning in our schools. And each of us, parents, educators, concerned citizens, need to play a role in the advocacy to make that happen. As far as at the individual level, I just want to share a quote from the film Beyond Measure. Sir Ken Robinson, I assume you know who he is, says at the very end of the film, if you're a teacher and you change what you do in your classroom, you've changed the education system for the students in your class. Now, I think that's a really empowering thought. As you know from reading the book, we share the story of Mike Miller, who is a teacher in Virginia. And on his own, once he had his own children, decided to reduce homework substantially, to make homework the exception rather than the rule, and to eliminate most quizzes and tests. And what he found is the students in his class did not become lazy all of a sudden, but in fact, they read more deeply, they thought more deeply, they wrote more creatively. And so I think that thought that Sir Ken Robinson shares at the end of the film applies to all of us, whether you're a parent, a teacher, a student. We all need to be advocates for change. And so for anyone here today, as well as the people that are listening, I would also encourage you to get this conversation started in your community. We are looking to launch a national conversation about what's possible and about the schools of the future. And we've created a lot of good resources to engage a community, to share the research behind these models that I think are forward-facing schools and better serve our students and our teachers. And so I would just say get involved, start a conversation, form alliances with like-minded people, and create the change that our kids need.
And if you haven't watched Ken Robinson's TED Talk on creativity, it's a must-watch. Google it, it's out on YouTube. So I want to invite up Ken Dauber. Ken is a Palo Alto Unified School District board member, and he's a Google staff engineer. I learned about Ken's passion for education reform from Vicki's book. He was quoted. He, as I suspect many of you know, Palo Alto School District is known for many things, for its education excellence. It is also known for its tragic suicide clusters. And Ken has a PhD in sociology from the University of Arizona and has on-the-ground experience making a difference in Bay Area schools. He's a board member at the Palo Alto School District. He's also consulted for the U.S. Department of Education and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, to name just a couple of the many things that he has done. So I brought Ken up here because he can bring a local perspective, and he's also part of Beyond Measure, the book. So I'm going to have the two of you respond to these questions, and you can chip in where you think it makes sense, but we'll start with Ken. So the Palo Alto Unified School District is known for its academic achievements, as I noted, and suicide clusters. How unique is this story in your research? And I'm very interested in your thoughts too, Vicki.
Well, I think that, unfortunately, our experience with suicide is unusual. I think that it's the level of academic achievement is pretty typical of affluent suburban communities across the United States. I think that, as Vicki has talked about, the issues of stress and sleep deprivation and so forth are really common across the country. And the issues that she is talking about here and in the book are really typical, not just in Palo Alto, but everywhere.
And I would just say, fortunately, we don't see lots of suicide clusters, but there are others across the country happening on some college campuses and high schools as well. It's just that Palo Alto seems to have gotten a lot of media attention of late. But like you, Ken, I believe that the underlying conditions that create the risk, they're there in many communities. And I think that we need to do something about that. Importantly, I just want to say those underlying conditions that I mentioned earlier as far as sleep deprivation, anxiety, and stress, not only are kids unhealthy today, but we are potentially setting them up for lifelong disease. And that is a reason, I think, for people to pay attention and to create action.
Well, I think another point there is that depression can be linked to sleep deprivation, but in fact, it's the other way around, that sleep deprivation can lead to depression. So I can talk about that a little bit, about how that connection between all the negative effects of sleep deprivation.
Well, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, one of the questions that people had in the relation between sleep deprivation and depression, for example, was which is causal. And there have been studies now that have really teased that out and shown that sleep has a lack of sleep has an independent effect. It's not just that being depressed reduces sleep, it's that, or has an effect on sleep, it's that loss of sleep can really have all kinds of negative health effects on depression, on things like, propensity to have a car accident, on suicidality, on depressing academic achievement. What I really found in looking at the research on sleep over the last few years is that to my mind, if there's a sort of silver bullet that we could fasten on to improve the lives of children at school and academic achievement, it would be sleep. And if you think about it from a kind of policy perspective, if we had policies that actually worked to encourage sleep, we would be doing so many positive things in order to get there, in terms of reducing homework and, encouraging and having later start times, encouraging students to spend time in the evening with their families and on other pursuits rather than on homework. All those positive things, if we could really move that needle, they'd have the direct effect on sleep, but they would also have all kinds of other positive effects.
I completely agree. And indeed, the American Academy of Pediatrics has recommended a later start time of 8:30 for middle and high schools. There are pockets of schools that are adopting that, but not nearly enough. And in their policy recommendation, they also cite homework and extracurricular activities as things that get in the way of sleep. So from my perspective, just going back to the question about one action, I would say homework is the low-hanging fruit here.
Yep.
Our kids, if you just take a look at a day in the life of a typical high school student, not an overscheduled student. We could take my son, for example. 5 or 6 academic classes, they spend 7.5 hours a day in school. Right there, that's nearly a 40-hour work week. And then if you factor in school-sponsored extracurriculars, just one extracurricular, whether that's a sports team, a debate club, theater. That's 15 to 20 hours pretty typically these days. Right there you've got a 60-hour week. And then you add on top of that homework. And homework studies are tricky because we're relying a lot on self-reporting. But there is a study that shows students today, on average, high school students are getting 18 hours of homework assigned to them. And that assumes that your child can do the work in that amount of time. That's become a third shift for our kids, and I think it is the single thing that is getting in the way of sleep. And it's also preventing our kids from developing in all kinds of other ways that are really important.
You talk about getting more sleep, and Ken, you specifically targeted zero period, infamous zero period, and went through quite a struggle to at least partially eliminate zero period from Palo Alto School District, including large resistance from students. So talk about how you approached that challenge of making the point you're trying to make and have it actually have some tangible action at the end, and how you worked through those objections.
So this was an issue that we worked through a year ago, and zero period is the period before the start of the school day. Our high schools changed their start times several years ago to around 8:30 to encourage sleep, but shortly after created so-called zero periods that start at 7:20 or so in the morning. And one of our high schools, Gunn, started to schedule a number of academic classes into zero period. And we had about 300 students in zero period at Gunn. And as Vicki said, a year and a half ago or so, the American Academy of Pediatrics came out with their recommendation on school start times of 8:30 or later, along with a whole really overwhelming amount of research that shows the serious negative effects of earlier start times. And so to me and to others in the community, this seemed like an obvious, to use Vicki's word, low-hanging fruit. Why do we have students taking academic classes in zero period? I raised this issue at the school board. Many local doctors eventually weighed in on this. I met with the pediatricians at Palo Alto Medical Foundation who saw this as an issue that was of real concern for them. And we advocated for a change in our school district practice to not have academic classes in zero period. We can get to the other things that are going on in zero period as well, you'll be hearing about the art of the possible at some point in here. But we did run into some significant resistance among students, hardly any among parents actually, but among students. And they organized very helpfully, really, a survey of students to say what it was. And one of the things that they were asking about is, what are students getting out of zero period? Why do they want zero period? And when I looked at those surveys and coded them up for the reasons, what I found is that there were two reasons. One is students wanted early morning classes so that they could get their homework done earlier because they could leave school earlier. And they also wanted early morning classes so that they could finish school in order to get to their sports activities. To me, what that really meant is that they were getting up early as a coping strategy for solving problems that we really should be solving for them, right? If we should not be creating a situation where kids feel like they have to get up early so that they can get to bed at a reasonable hour because they have so much homework after school. And we should be arranging their sports schedules so that they can, go to school at a reasonable hour, finish at a reasonable hour, and then go on to their competitions. So to me, what was clear is that the student support for zero period was largely around solving problems that we should be solving more directly. It's also the case, I think, that students experienced it as a sort of a lack of control. And one of the things that I think we're giving students with the way that we're organizing life at school is an experience of lack of control. You know, they just don't have a sense that they are in control of their lives, because very often they're not. I mean, from morning till night, they're doing things that they're not really choosing to do. And this felt to them like a lack of choice, sort of paradoxically, but I think in, you know, real terms.
And I would just add that the lack of choice is just one more factor, I believe, that contributes to depression and is out of sync with the research around motivation and what we know supports motivation, giving people autonomy and opportunities to have mastery experiences. And then importantly, I would also add, as far as the depression and anxiety, is so much of their student day, not only do they not have a choice about it, but often there's a disconnect and no purpose seen in what they're doing. And so Bill Damon, a professor at Stanford University, writes a lot about this, that is the lack of purpose that is also contributing to epidemic rates of anxiety and depression. So I think that's also really important, giving our students more choice and more opportunities for connection between the work that they're doing and meaning in their lives.
So before I open up to questions from the audience, and I'll check the Dory too, just to close off thoughts from both of you. So reading this book, I had to read it in chunks because it got me very wound up. I had to chill out a little bit. It's a great book. I'm encouraging you to read it. Just you may have to read it in pieces because it was both inspiring in parts, it was very frustrating in parts, and it's not hard for me to feel as a parent with a sophomore that it's almost too late for me to make change for my younger daughter, but I'm going to try to. I'm going to do everything I can to try to. What gives you hope that widespread change is possible?
So everywhere I go, I'm inspired by fearless change makers and people who are starting to ask questions. I think the frustration of any, which I've experienced also, being that my youngest is now a high school junior, is that we need to accelerate the rate of change. And we need to make it possible for people to come forward with both their questions and their ideas.
So I think that one of the things that gives me real optimism is that I think in the past people had seen health for students and well-being and learning and achievement as two kind of opposed values, and that we had to trade off one against the other, right? So if you want healthy students and well-rested students, the cost of that is less achievement, right? Less homework, less rigor. And what I think is really becoming clear and well understood across and certainly our community, is that these are not opposed. In fact, they're reinforcing that you really cannot have students who are learning and getting what we want them to get out of school and have them be sleep deprived and anxious and depressed. And those are really inconsistent with each other. So I and many others in Palo Alto have really tried to carry that message, and I think it's a message that people are hearing. And I also agree with Vicki that working that into actual practice. These are big entrenched organizations. They are not easy to change, but it's possible. Winning elections to school boards, forming parent groups, having local blogs that focus on these issues. Those are all things that really make a difference. Talking to your parent's teacher so that they hear. So that their experience is parents who want less rather than parents who want more. Those are all things that make change possible to happen.
I'll just add real quickly, and so I completely agree with you. Health and learning go hand in hand, and our new film features these schools that are really creating new and transformative learning experiences. So not just reducing homework and assessment, but actually looking at the research around how people learn and making the learning much more hands-on, much more meaningful, experiential. So I would just encourage all of you who are listening today to help us take this to a cultural conversation and to know there is a better way to educate our kids and prepare them for their future while not stealing their childhood in the process.
Although we talk a lot about the middle schools and the high schools making all these changes, I'm just curious, Vicki, how receptive have the colleges been to your research and your books and movies? And, are they open to these changes? Because we can do all of that here, but if you're all mindful through middle school and high school and then you get to college and you can't even keep up, what's going to happen to these kids? It doesn't really matter now if the colleges aren't open to it. So I'm just curious how much success you've had there.
So I have a long-winded response to that, but let me just say that colleges are seeing the outcomes from this very narrow vision for schooling, and they're also wanting the change. So if you're not familiar with this, a couple months ago, a new report came out from a consortium of colleges. It's called Turning the Tide, and it's making caring more common. And so colleges absolutely recognize that we have a problem, but like many of us, I think they're also afraid to go first, which is why doing these things in collaboration and as a movement is so important. They are seeing the outcomes with wellness centers that are beyond their capacity, with students who are leaving college their first year. So as a parent, what I will say with 2 daughters in college, it's much more important for our children to show up at college with the life skills that they need, with the resiliency, and with the passion for learning, not schooled out of them. So colleges are absolutely receptive to that. And what I also want to share is we recently screened Beyond Measure at Olin College, which is one of the colleges featured in the film. And I sat on a panel with Liz Coleman, who is the former president of Bennington College. And the question posed to her was, what is it going to take to create an education revolution? And Liz Coleman's response was that we're not going to have an education revolution until we stop seeing kindergarten through 12th grade as preparation for college, right? And then she went on with a very provocative thought, which is, what if K through 12 was so incredible that our kids didn't need to go to college? And so I would just challenge all of us to rethink what we're doing in our schools to allow our kids to be present with their experiences today and to know that that's going to serve them in the long run, whatever their path may be.
And I think I just want to, before we pass to any other questions, have a personal anecdote that I shared with our school district, that I don't know if I would be a software engineer today if I had had the amount of homework kids have now. What was I doing after school when I had free time? I was coding an Apple II computer. And I was absolutely obsessed with that. I was passionate about that. If I had no time left, that passion would not have had a chance to flourish, except in the window of the summer, which is pretty well scheduled too today. So that free time, I think there's a fear of free time, that somehow that free time is going to be wasted if left up to the child to figure out what to do with. What's missed there is that free time may result in some boredom, and that boredom will eventually get trounced by the desire to do something fun and creative. And boredom is actually a great trigger of creativity. Mm-hmm. So in my own personal experience, I can see a difference between if I was a student now, I don't know if I would have had the time to become a software engineer in high school.
And I would also add to that those moments after school when your kids are doing things that they're interested in and they're passionate about, that's actually where the self-learning kicks in. It's where the perseverance kicks in, when they're doing something because they want to do it, where they learn those skills that we all know are so critical for their success.
I have a question about homework policy and pursuing changes with that. It's likely to be most successful as a collaborative process where we involve a lot of the stakeholders. And I'm thinking we may find some resistance, either from parents or from teachers. Do you have any perspectives on, who we might find resistance from and how to address that so that we can continue to move forward?
Well, you're always going to find people who are opposed to change, right? What we find is it tends to be 10 to 20% of the people, whether it's teachers or parents, who are opposed, right? The rest of the people really want the change. And so what I would say is within a school, make it optional, right? I think just going back to one of James's questions about what's the most inspiring change, I think the opportunity to create a school within a school or a school within a district or a third grade class within a third grade elementary, program at an elementary school, and allow the people who are ready for that kind of change to opt in. Allow the teachers who are ready to teach without assigning homework and constant testing, allow them to opt in, and then let the parents and students opt in. And when other people see that the world doesn't fall apart, and in fact, kids come to school much more curious and creative and rested, I think you'll see those changes start to spread. But the reality is, when you're talking specifically about homework, I just need to say, going back to the low-hanging fruit, there's no research to support in elementary school. In middle school, it's very little research to support it. Even in high school, the OECD, which is the organization that administers the PISA test, the international test that our kids participate in. The countries, first of all, that lead the way in those tests, Finland, as an example, assign far less homework than we do in this country. And what the OECD has concluded, that in high school, after 4 hours a week of homework, you see diminishing returns. And we know that many students are suffering under the burden of 4 hours a night. So I think health is so critically important that we begin to address it. If you take homework off the table, I've had pediatricians say you'd see health outcomes improve overnight. And I think in that way we would also free schools up to begin to redesign learning experiences.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, I think homework is a really fascinating cultural phenomenon. There's very little evidence that it has, as Vicki says, much of an educational effect. And certainly the levels that we see are demonstrated to have a negative effect. Yet we are consuming enormous amounts of it. It's kind of a mania almost. I think it'd be well worth delving into why that is. And it has, and if you I was on the district homework committee in Palo Alto, and one of the things that we had to do was kind of peel up the sort of moral and dimensions of homework. Homework is good for kids because it makes them self-disciplined and teaches them all these things that there's no evidence that it actually teaches them. And if we were trying to teach them that, we would have a curriculum for it. We wouldn't just send them home with a book and hope that they get through it. I do think that, at least our experience in Palo Alto, is that there is no real opposition to limiting, to a policy that limits homework. I think the biggest obstacle to change, and what we really found, is passing the policy was easy. Implementing it has been very difficult, not because of organized resistance, but because of organizational inertia, really, and providing the tools that to make homework visible. I mean, one of the problems with homework is that it happens at home where nobody can see it. So it's kind of an unfunded mandate. So making it even visible to teachers and to administrators is a step that we have to take. In fact, that's one of the things I would really, I'm pressing on us to do next year, is to provide a feedback mechanism that's reliable so that teachers can actually see how much time is being spent. Because it's hard to control something that you can't see or measure.
Two quick thoughts on that. I think it's a great question, and it's a really important conversation that we need to have in our school communities, is what time belongs to the family? Yeah. And I would argue that weekends belong to the family every weekend. The idea that our kids are working 7 days a week, that they never have a day without something hanging over their head. And we know, from the research that that is not the best way to grow and develop all of the things that we care about, right? So weekends, holiday breaks, summer breaks. And, I think that the next step is our evenings. We are not giving our kids a choice about going home in the evening and putting in that second or third shift, where we as adults do have a choice and more flexibility and room to navigate the demands. And we're also adults. These are kids and teenagers whose bodies and minds are still growing and developing. And, there's something really wrong with the idea that we think it's okay for them to be putting in a 70-hour work week. To go back to your question, though, in terms of resistance or what support I would just say is needed in order to make these changes, I actually think that professional development is needed for teachers, because if you take homework off the table, that's an integral part of many teachers' practice. And what we have found in the schools that we visited that have eliminated homework, when the principals speak to us candidly, they say it's actually not the parents who are resisting, it's many of our teachers. And so I would just recommend anybody who wants to have this conversation. Dr. Etta Kralovic at the University of Arizona is an expert in this space. She loves to do professional development for teachers. She just is online today with an interview about eliminating all homework K through 12. And I would argue to make it the exception rather than the rule.
I really agree with everything you've said so far on the well-being of students and kind of changing the culture of your classroom so that students are not just regurgitating what you're teaching, but really hands-on. So that was my approach going into my pre-calc class. But throughout the semester, I was kind of torn because students were preparing for the AP Calc test next year. And, at the end of every year, there's these standardized testings. And I realized that even though the students enjoyed the culture and they were learning, as I can tell in our class, they were struggling with the actual wording, reading, understanding what the standardized questions were asking. So I taught the math in a different way than how the standardized testing was asking the questions, and I saw a huge struggle in that. And while on one hand I really want to keep that culture and promote their learning like hands-on, but on the other hand, I didn't want to be the person that let them fail the test and not be able to, go to a good college or something, because that's still the way our education system is. So I'm just wondering, from your point of views, both of you, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, so this is an issue that I've talked about a little bit on the school board, is that the cost of standardized tests and AP tests and things like that is that we take teachers like you who bring their own particular gifts and interests and passions, and we divert them towards serving goals that are formulated elsewhere. A curriculum that's developed in New Jersey is going to be less good, but for students, than a curriculum that's developed by the teachers who are standing in front of them and that is responsive to what their interests are. So I think that's kind of the hidden cost of this level of standardization that we're seeing.
I completely agree. I would love to speak to you afterwards. We're actually just finishing up a film examining math education in this country. And the experts in that film are real advocates to transform what we're doing in our math classrooms to a direction much more in line with what you just described.
Thank you again for taking your time today to share this important topic.
Thank you, Dave.